On a frigid January morning in 1943, a maid at the New Yorker hotel ignored a "Do Not Disturb" sign that had been hanging for 2 days. Inside room 3327, she found the emaciated body of an 86-year-old man who had been living on little more than crackers and warm milk. To the hotel staff, he was merely a recluse who spoke to pigeons. But within hours, the gears of the United States government began to turn with frantic precision. The Office of Alien Property Custodian, acting under the direct authority of the FBI, moved in to seize every scrap of paper, every notebook, and every trunk the old man owned. This was Nikola Tesla, a man whose mind had quite literally wired the modern world. Yet the paradox of his end is staggering. We are told he was the master of lightning, the man who invented the 20th century, yet he died in a state of self-imposed exile, bypassed by the very industrial age he birthed. Was he a visionary crushed by the cold machinery of capitalism, or a genius who gradually lost his grip on the physical laws of our reality? To understand why the most influential inventor of his time vanished into obscurity while his inventions ran the world, we have to look past the myth. According to declassified FBI documents, the government's primary concern wasn't his past achievements in electricity, but his claims of a death ray, a weapon he insisted could melt airplane engines from 250 miles away. While modern historians such as Bernard Carlson argue that Tesla's later years were marked by grandiosity and unfinished projects, the sheer scale of what he actually accomplished remains the bedrock of our civilization. He didn't just give us light, he gave us a world that never sleeps. And then he watched that world leave him behind. To understand the man who would eventually claim to harness the power of the sun, we must first strip away the bronze statues and the internet memes. In the 1880s, New York City was a jagged, filthy landscape of gaslight and horse manure, a place where innovation was less about divine inspiration and more about brutal survival. When Nikola Tesla stepped off the boat in 1884, he wasn't a conqueror. He was a desperate immigrant with 4 cents in his pocket and a mind that functioned like a high-definition projector, a gift that many modern neurologists, looking back at his documented symptoms, would classify as a severe form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. He didn't just think in ideas, he saw 3-dimensional machines so vivid they were indistinguishable from reality. He would test his inventions in the laboratory of his own mind, running a motor for weeks in his head to see which part would wear out first. It was a terrifyingly efficient way to work, but it isolated him. While others collaborated and iterated, Tesla existed in a singular internal world where the laws of physics were his only companions. This wasn't the polished brilliance of a legend. It was the frantic energy of a man haunted by visions he couldn't yet prove to a skeptical world. His first real collision with the American dream happened at Edison Machine Works. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, was the gatekeeper of the era's energy. But there was a fundamental friction between them. Edison was a trial-and-error tinkerer who believed in direct current, a system that was safe but agonizingly limited, requiring a power plant every mile. Tesla brought the concept of alternating current, a sophisticated mathematical solution that could send power across hundreds of miles. Reality check. Popular history often frames this as a battle between a saintly Tesla and a demonic Edison. However, historians like W. Bernard Carlson note that the conflict was as much about ego and cultural clashing as it was about science. Tesla was a European intellectual who expected professional chivalry. Edison was a rugged American industrialist who valued moxie over math. When Edison famously told Tesla, "You don't understand our American humor," after allegedly reneging on a $50,000 bonus for motor designs, it wasn't just a betrayal of money. It was Tesla's first realization that in the New World, a brilliant idea was worthless if it couldn't be fenced in and sold. The fallout was immediate and humiliating. Tesla didn't find another financier right away. Instead, he spent the winter of 1886 and 1887 digging ditches for the very company he had just helped improve. Imagine the psychological toll. The man who had mentally mapped the future of global energy was now sweating in the mud of New York streets for $2 a day. This period is often glossed over, but it is the crucible of his story. It was here that his resentment toward the practical man solidified. During these months of manual labor, Tesla's mental state was fragile. He wrote in his diaries that his education in science felt like a mockery while he was performing the work of an animal. Yet, even in the dirt, the reality check remains. Tesla didn't give up because he couldn't. His brain was incapable of turning off the simulations. By the time he finally found investors for the Tesla Electric Company, he wasn't just looking to succeed, he was looking for vindication. He wasn't building for profit. He was building to prove that his internal world was the real one, and the physical world was simply lagging behind. This disconnect, this preference for the abstract over the economic, was the seed of his greatest triumph, but also the blueprint for his inevitable ruin. By 1888, the ditch digging was over, but a far more violent struggle was beginning. Nikola Tesla had finally found a patron in George Westinghouse, a man who possessed the industrial muscle that Tesla lacked. Together, they launched an assault on the status quo that history now remembers as the War of Currents. This wasn't a polite debate in a lecture hall. It was a street fight for the soul of the 20th century. On one side was Thomas Edison's direct current, safe, familiar, but inefficient. On the other was Tesla's alternating current, a surging, rhythmic force that could bridge continents but terrified the public. To protect his empire, Edison launched a smear campaign that remains one of the darkest chapters in American corporate history. He didn't just lobby politicians, he weaponized fear. Under the guise of public safety, Edison's associates began staging gruesome public demonstrations, using Tesla's AC current to electrocute stray dogs and horses. They wanted the public to associate the name Tesla with sudden, invisible death. When the state of New York sought a more humane method of execution, Edison's team covertly pushed for an AC-powered chair, hoping the electric chair would become the ultimate marketing nightmare for Tesla's invention. Reality check. While the popular narrative often paints Edison as a lone villain, historical analysis of the Edison Electric Light Company archives suggests this was a desperate corporate strategy driven by investors as much as by Edison himself. DC was a failing technology, and they knew it. The brutality of these public killings was a last-ditch effort to stall an inevitable technological shift. Tesla's response, however, was not to argue in the press, but to perform. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Tesla staged a spectacle that felt like sorcery. Before a crowd of thousands, he allowed 200,000 volts of electricity to surge through his own body, lighting up lamps and shooting sparks from his fingertips. He survived because he understood the skin effect, the way high-frequency current travels over the surface of a conductor rather than through the vital organs. But to the spectators, he was a man who had tamed lightning. That night, when he flipped a switch and 100,000 glowing bulbs turned the Chicago night into day, the War of Currents was effectively over. The ultimate victory came at Niagara Falls. Tesla and Westinghouse built the world's first large-scale hydroelectric plant, proving that the raw power of nature could be converted into a digital-like pulse and sent to cities hundreds of miles away. It was a moment of supreme triumph. For the first time, human civilization was no longer tethered to the location of its fuel. But here is where the reality of the genius begins to fracture. To win this war, Westinghouse had nearly bankrupted himself. In a moment that defies every law of modern capitalism, Tesla chose to save his friend rather than secure his own bloodline. When Westinghouse explained that his creditors were demanding his removal, Tesla reportedly took his contract, a document that promised him a royalty of $2.50 per horsepower of AC electricity sold, and tore it to pieces. Reality check. There is lingering academic debate over the exact nature of this torn contract. While the story is a staple of Tesla lore, some economic historians, such as Jill Janes in Empires of Light, suggest the move was more calculated than purely altruistic. Tesla knew that if Westinghouse went under, the AC patents would be tied up in court for decades, and his dream would die with the company. By saving Westinghouse, Tesla was trying to save the future of electricity. However, in doing so, he forfeited a fortune that would have been worth billions today. He traded the role of the world's wealthiest man for the role of a permanent outsider. He had won the war for the world's light, but he had just lost the war for his own autonomy. From this point on, Nikola Tesla was no longer an owner. He was a tenant in a world built on his own ideas. Having secured the world's light but sacrificed his fortune, Tesla entered the 1890s with a mind that had outgrown the wires of the electrical grid. He began to obsess over a concept that sounded like madness to his contemporaries: a world without cables. He moved his operations to the high altitudes of Colorado Springs, constructing a laboratory that looked like a temple to the gods of thunder. Here, amidst the thin air, he claimed to have discovered terrestrial stationary waves, the idea that the Earth itself could be used as a conductor, a massive tuning fork that could carry energy to any point on the globe. He wasn't just dreaming of a better light bulb, he was envisioning the world wireless system. In his notebooks, he described a device that could fit in a pocket, capable of receiving music, news, and even stock reports from across the ocean. It was the blueprint for the smartphone, drafted in a world that still relied on steam engines. But to realize this, he needed a monster. He returned to New York and convinced the financier J.P. Morgan to invest $150,000, a massive sum, yet a mere fraction of what was actually required to build a gargantuan transmission tower on Long Island known as Wardenclyffe. Reality check. This is where the narrative of the suppressed genius often veers into myth. While enthusiasts claim Tesla was on the verge of providing free energy to all, mainstream science remains skeptical. Engineering analysis of Tesla's Wardenclyffe design suggests that the inverse square law of physics would have made efficient power transmission over long distances nearly impossible with the technology of 1901. Furthermore, historical records from the J.P. Morgan archives show that the bankers' withdrawal of support wasn't just a conspiracy to keep energy paid for, it was a cold reaction to Tesla's lack of transparency. Tesla had told Morgan he was building a radio tower to compete with Marconi, but he was secretly using the funds to pursue his more radical global power ambitions. As the tower rose, a 187-foot wooden giant topped with a massive steel hemisphere, Tesla's grasp on his industrial reality began to slip. He was no longer just an inventor, he was a prophet of a future that his investors found terrifyingly unprofitable. When Guglielmo Marconi successfully sent a radio signal across the Atlantic using a much simpler and cheaper apparatus, Morgan's patience evaporated. He saw Marconi as a businessman who could deliver a product, and Tesla as a dreamer who could only deliver excuses. The blow was fatal. Morgan didn't just stop the funding, he used his immense influence to ensure no other Wall Street titan would touch the project. Tesla pleaded, his letters becoming increasingly desperate, even hysterical, invoking the fate of humanity. But in the eyes of the Gilded Age, he had committed the ultimate sin. He had failed to provide a return on investment. By 1905, the Wardenclyffe dream was rotting. The tower stood as a skeletal monument to his hubris, eventually sold for scrap to pay off his mounting hotel bills. Tesla's mental state during this collapse is a subject of intense historical debate. Some biographers, like Mark Seifer, point to a profound nervous breakdown, while others suggest this was the moment his obsessive-compulsive traits evolved into full-blown psychosis. He began to believe he was receiving signals from Mars. He became obsessed with the cleanliness of his utensils and the exact volume of his food. The man who had tamed the Niagara Falls was now being defeated by the mundane requirements of a capitalistic society. He had tried to bypass the world's economic constraints by tapping into the very fabric of the planet, but instead he found himself unplugged from the world he helped create. He was now a genius without a laboratory, a king without a country, beginning a long, slow descent into the shadows of New York's luxury hotels, where he would spend the next 4 decades living on credit and fading memories. The final decades of Nikola Tesla's life were not spent in a laboratory, but in a sequence of increasingly modest hotel rooms, where the boundary between groundbreaking science and grand delusion began to dissolve. By the 1930s, the man who had electrified the world had become a public curiosity, a mad scientist archetype that the press trotted out every July on his birthday to solicit sensational headlines. He would tell reporters of a death beam so powerful it could bring down 10,000 aircraft from 400 kilometers away. An invisible wall of energy that would make war impossible by making every nation invulnerable. To Tesla, this was his ultimate gift to peace, a deterrent so absolute it would render aggression obsolete. Reality check. While popular culture often depicts the death ray as a suppressed superweapon, modern ballistics and physics research offer a more sobering perspective. In 1943, an MIT professor and esteemed engineer for the National Defense Research Committee, Dr. John G. Trump, reviewed Tesla's papers for the FBI. His official report concluded that Tesla's thoughts and methods were speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional, lacking the sound physical principles required for a functional weapon. Whether Tesla had actually solved the engineering hurdles or was merely weaponizing his own reputation to gain relevance remains a subject of intense debate among military historians. As his physical world shrank, Tesla's internal world grew increasingly erratic. He spent his days in Bryant Park surrounded by pigeons, claiming he could communicate with them. He famously declared his love for a specific white pigeon, stating that as long as she needed him, there was a purpose to his life. It is easy to dismiss this as the senility of an old man, but for a mind that had always prioritized the abstract over the human, this was perhaps the only intimacy he could tolerate. He had no wife, no children, and few friends left who weren't creditors. He had lived his entire life in a state of high-frequency vibration, and now the gears were simply grinding to a halt. Yet, even in this decline, the shadow of his genius loomed over the impending Second World War. The U.S. government was terrified that his death ray papers might fall into the hands of the Axis powers. The moment his heart stopped in room 3327, the investigative machinery of the state took over. The irony is bitter. The man who was ignored by the financial elite for decades was, upon his death, treated as the most dangerous intellectual asset on the planet. His life's work was stuffed into boxes and labeled top secret, much of it vanishing into the archives of the Office of Alien Property, never to be seen in full by the public again. Reality check. Many of the missing Tesla papers are the source of modern conspiracy theories regarding anti-gravity and free energy. However, historians note that many of these documents were eventually released to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. The missing files may not contain lost physics, but rather the tragic record of a brilliant mind spiraling into unfinished, fragmented ideas that the government simply didn't want to risk leaving in the open. Ultimately, Tesla's tragedy wasn't that he was wrong, but that he was early. He lived to see the world adopt his AC power, but he died before the digital age could prove his theories on wireless communication and robotics. He lost control of his inventions because he refused to play by the rules of the world they built. He gave us the 20th century, but he remained a citizen of the 21st, an exile in time who forgot that to change the world, one must also survive it. We walk through cities that throb with his pulse, using devices that breathe through his airwaves, yet his name was nearly erased from the textbooks for half a century. We are left with a haunting question of morality and intellect. If Tesla had been a better businessman, if he had kept his royalties and played the corporate game, would he have been more successful? Or would that very pragmatism have extinguished the mad spark that allowed him to see the impossible? His life is a warning that genius without control is a flame that eventually consumes its own lamp. As we look at the giants of modern tech who now invoke his name, we have to wonder, are they following his vision, or are they just the new owners of the cage he escaped? If you were in his room in 1943 holding the keys to a world of free energy that would destroy the global economy, would you have published it? Or would you have done what Tesla did and taken the best of it to the grave? Share your thoughts in the comments. Was he a fallen hero or a man who simply flew too close to the sun?